Hello and welcome to the fourth podcast, the fourth instalment in this series of podcasts on medicine through time. This podcast is going to look at probably the smallest strand out of the five, which is hospitals and change and continuity which occurred in hospitals from the Roman to the modern day era. So we'll begin now with the Romans and what Roman hospitals were like. Now, for the general population and even the rich, hospitals were not available during Roman times. Most people were treated at home by the male members of the family through herbal remedies. If you were wealthy, physicians could come to your home. The only people who had access to hospitals were soldiers, and those hospitals that they did have access to were very clean, hygienic. You would have the best physicians there to be able to treat the soldiers in those hospitals, and this was largely down to the fact that the government prioritised the health of soldiers because they were essentially the ones who would be maintaining law and order within the empire. Now, as we move to the Dark Ages, naturally, like with most facilities, ideas and beliefs, we see a decrease in hospitals. And when I say decrease, effectively there's no hospitals around at all, because the Roman army leaves, and as a result of them leaving, the hospitals break down and disintegrate and are not maintained. And we don't really see any sort of hospitals as such until the end of the era, when the Christian church has obviously started to grow and society at the end of the Dark Ages has become more settled, and monasteries start to open and be more common across the country. And monasteries would form a sort of hospital during this era where the old and sick and poor could be cared for. But when we talk about care, it's having a warm bed to sleep in, it's being given food, it's being given water. They are not administering bleeding, they are not administering any medical treatment as such. It is more of a care. The biblical sick are also treated there, such as lepers. But once again, most people, like really in the Roman era, are treated at home, except the difference between that treatment from the Roman to the Dark Age era is there aren't any physicians really in the Dark Ages, so that care at home is not going to be as potentially robust. So, as we've already mentioned, the church builds those monasteries in the later part of the Dark Ages. And during the medieval era, those monasteries continue to be a source of care, a form of hospital. But at the end of the medieval era, we see those monasteries disappearing, with Henry VIII getting rid of them in the Reformation. There were a variety of people that you could go to be treated, although that treatment would still be centred in the home, so the majority of people, rich and poor, would be treated at home. The very poor, though, at the end of this time period, so the late 1500s, would be treated or could get some treatment in poorhouses. They almost had sort of a treatment facility within them, and they would treat the poor. But that treatment, there was not usually a doctor there. It would be a bed. It would be giving them food, giving them a bed and keeping them warm. Largely sometimes seeing them through to their death. Now, as we move into the Renaissance era, we have the continuation of the poorhouses, but a growth in more, at the very sort of end of the Renaissance, more charitable hospitals or voluntary hospitals as they are called. And these charitable hospitals, though, still are places you wouldn't go to be treated. They're more places that you would go to and die because you was at the end of your life or too sick. And once again, most people were treated in their homes. But as we move into the Renaissance era, we start to see people be treated in their homes more by the women of the household rather than the men of the household in the Renaissance era. Sorry, the Roman era. And really our big change, our big shift, big improvement in hospitals comes between 1750 and 1900. And even then, realistically, it's not until 1850 that we start to see changes in hospitals. Now, in 1859, we see the first cottage hospitals. And cottage hospitals are around really until the 60s and 70s in Britain, even later on than that in some cases. And by 1900, there are 300 cottage hospitals across Britain. Now, these cottage hospitals provided nursing care. So, care that could be given from nurses who were largely untrained. Medical treatment from GPs would still come from GPs, and that would have to be paid for. So these cottage hospitals, yes, you could get some nursing care there, but effective medical treatment still couldn't be got in those cottage hospitals because you had to pay, so they were inaccessible to the poor. There were voluntary or charity hospitals during this period, and these voluntary hospitals were where doctors gave services for free, dependent on how much money that you actually had, so sometimes it would be free for the poor. The upper and middle classes in society, though, like in the Renaissance, the medieval era, right through to the Roman era, were treated at home, and physicians would come to their homes and would administer treatment there. It was the working class people who attended these voluntary hospitals largely, or dispensaries or outpatient departments in hospitals where they wouldn't have to pay for their care as such. They could go in, be told what was wrong with them, and then they would go away and try and gather up a treatment for it. Now, because of this, many sick, old and disabled ended up, like in the Renaissance and the medieval era, in poorhouses. But by the sort of mid to late 1800s, poorhouses were starting to be heavily criticised by the public. And there was a lot of pressure put on government to make a change because taxes were increasing because of the large numbers of people actually entering these workhouses. So in 1867, the government ordered that the poor law unions, so groups in charge of areas, so clusters almost of poorhouses, people who were in charge of them, were ordered to join together to build what were known as infirmaries. And so these infirmaries were meant to be separate completely from workhouses and should have had a full-time doctor in them. And these were the first type of hospitals that could be used by all and freely. In addition to this, there should be asylums built to treat the mental health, and also separate fever houses for those who were infected with infectious diseases. At first, they didn't make them completely separate. It took a long time for these to be put into place due to money, resistance, attitudes and beliefs at the time. But by the 1900s, they have become quite effective and are quite widespread in their usage across the UK. We all see also standards improving in these hospitals post 1850 due to the influence of Nightingale and what she does in Scutari, and her later publications on notes on hospitals, and her model hospital, with which other hospitals are actually designed from afterwards. So by the end of the 1800s, moving into the 1900s, we have infirmaries which provided more care by this point than voluntary hospitals for the poor. And we actually see many of these infirmaries turning into general hospitals in post-1948 because they are actually very effective in what they do. We do see more charity hospitals being established. The problem was with these charity hospitals was they gave better care to wealthier areas than to poorer areas. So you had an unfair healthcare system in place. The wealthy got very good healthcare, the poor didn't get very good healthcare. But the government do try to improve this from 1919 to 1939 by taking over hospitals and putting them under their control. But that isn't all healthcare. It's not until 1948, when the NHS is established, that all hospitals are brought under the control of government and are run by local authorities to regulate hospitals, regulate the standards, make sure there is complete equal access to treatment and consultants and doctors at all levels for all people in hospitals. So as a whole, if we take that as an overview, even in the Roman era, yes, hospitals that are there are effective for their time period. They are only accessible to a tiny proportion of the population. And you see that really right from the Renaissance through to around the 1800s, because most people are treated in their homes unless they are very, very sick, old, and then generally they will go to monasteries, but when monasteries are broken down in the 1500s, by the Reformation, it's moving into poorhouses, and it's not until the 1850s that we see that switch from poorhouses being made separate to hospitals to treat the sick rather than help those who cannot work at all. And then post 1850, it's a continual improvement, although slow, in hospitals and the quality of facilities that are offered, the hygiene which is within them, the care which is offered within them. And then by 1948, it's making sure that it's fair right across the board with hospitals as a whole. Now, I hope you have found that useful and have gained an overview of how hospitals have changed over time and considered why that is the case. That's the end of our fourth instalment in these 5 podcasts, and our final podcast is on public health, and I hope to have you listen to that one as well. And thank you very much for listening and spending the time to listen to this podcast on hospitals.